Good evening and welcome in. If you would like a quiet companion in the background while the night settles, stay with me for a while. Tonight we will wander slowly through Elysium, that gentle and enduring idea from the Greek imagination, the blessed place where the weary, the favored, and the heroic were sometimes said to rest. We will not rush it. We will let the old stories unfold at an unhurried pace, moving through poetry, belief, philosophy, and the soft edges where one ancient vision becomes another. Elysium is not only a place in myth, it is also a word that has traveled through centuries, carrying the memory of peace, reward, and a world beyond ordinary effort. If this kind of calm journey helps you unwind, you are welcome to like the video, subscribe for more quiet documentaries, or leave a gentle comment about where you are listening from tonight, or what topic you might like to drift into next. Settle comfortably wherever you are. Let your shoulders soften. Let the room grow dim and still. There is no need to hold on to anything here except the feeling of a story moving slowly in the dark. And so, with the quiet of late evening around us, we can begin with the first of many small facts about Elysium and let the old world speak in a low, steady voice. Elysium begins not as a single fixed map location, but as a shifting idea in Greek thought, one that could mean a blessed field, a far island, or a peaceful region beyond the ordinary reach of death. In the earliest layers of the tradition, it stands apart from the darker and more crowded picture of the underworld. It is not the realm of punishment. It is the softer corner of the afterlife, reserved for a small and fortunate company. That distinction matters because it shows how the Greeks imagined moral and spiritual difference even after life had ended. What makes Elysium especially interesting is that it was never entirely one thing for all writers. In some poems, it feels like a place set apart by geography, almost as though it might lie beyond the horizon, waiting in the gentlest light. In others, it becomes less a physical destination and more a condition of blessed existence. That flexibility helped the idea survive. A place that could be described in several ways could also belong to several periods of thought. It could remain recognizable even while changing shape. In Homer's world, Elysium is already a place of ease, where life is gentle and the weather is mild. The air is never harsh there. No snow, no violent storm, no heavy labor presses upon its inhabitants. The setting feels almost like a dream of the perfect season, forever held in place. Ancient listeners would have heard in this a contrast with the uncertainty of human existence, where weather, war, and illness could alter the day without warning. The calm of Elysium is not only climatic, but emotional. Homer presents it as a place where suffering has been thinned away, where the normal pressures of mortal life no longer arrive with such force. That idea would have felt especially meaningful in a world where daily survival depended on the seasons, on travel, on agriculture, and on the fragile balance of household life. A place without storms was more than a pleasant image. It was a vision of release. Elysium is also tied to the idea of special favor. It is not simply for everyone, but for a chosen few. That exclusivity gave the place a quiet seriousness in ancient poetry. It suggested that excellence, divine attention, or heroic standing might continue after death in a form of reward that ordinary souls did not receive. That sense of selection is part of what gives Elysium its strange emotional balance. It is comforting, but not casual. The place is beautiful, but not universal. In that way, it reflects a familiar pattern in early Greek thought, where the gods and fate often distribute blessings unevenly. Elysium becomes one more example of a world in which some lives are granted an exceptional ending, not because death disappears, but because death is transformed. The name itself has fascinated scholars for a very long time, and its deeper origin remains uncertain. Some linked it with sacred wandering, some with arrival, and some with old regional or religious concepts now partly lost. That uncertainty gives Elysium an especially soft outline. It is ancient but never fully fixed. This uncertainty is part of its power. A word whose beginnings cannot be fully pinned down can gather layers of meaning over time. It can absorb associations from poetry, ritual, geography, and imagination. Elysium has done exactly that. It has become a vessel for long memory, with its original source partly hidden by centuries of retelling. The mystery is not a flaw. It is one of the reasons the name still feels luminous. A little later, poets would make the place more vivid by placing it at the ends of the world in the far west, where the sun descends and the land seems to thin into memory. That western direction mattered a great deal in Greek imagination. It suggested a threshold, a place where the known world fades and the unseen begins. The west was not just a compass point, it was a symbolic edge. It was where daylight ended, where the sky softened, and where people could imagine a passage into another order of existence. To set Elysium, there was to place it in the hour of fading light, in the interval between visibility and disappearance. That fittingly gentle location helped make the place feel less like a domain of finality and more like a suspension, as if death itself had become a calm horizon. In early descriptions, Elysium is not gloomy, not judicial, and not frightening. It is calm. The tone is almost pastoral, as if the afterlife had been imagined not with smoke and fire, but with a meadow after rain, when the air is clear and the earth gives off a quiet fragrance. This pastoral quality is important because it makes Elysium feel inhabited by the rhythms of comfort rather than judgment. There are hints of open space, of green growth, of the kind of landscape that invites rest without demanding effort. In a literary world full of omens, curses, and divine punishment, Elysium stands apart as a place of gentleness. It is one of the earliest examples of the afterlife being portrayed as a landscape of ease rather than terror. Later writers would continue to reshape this idea, but the oldest image is already powerful. A world where death does not necessarily mean suffering, and where the best lives may continue in serenity. That gentle promise helped Elysium endure for centuries, because it spoke to something deeply human. Even in a culture that accepted the shadowed inevitability of death, people still dreamed of a place where peace might outlast pain. This is part of why Elysium remained attractive even when Greek religious thought became more complex. As ideas about souls, moral accounting, and divine order evolved, Elysium could still be imagined as a final reward that was neither coldly abstract nor unbearably severe. It offered a soft answer to a hard question. What becomes of a life that has reached its end? Elysium answers with rest. The earliest Greek poets also framed Elysium as a location of exceptional natural beauty. The grass was said to be soft, the breeze mild, the sea nearby in some versions, and the whole setting more luminous than the ordinary world. This is one reason the idea remained so memorable. It was not abstract theology. It was a picture the mind could rest inside. The details matter because they make the place sensory. One can almost imagine the texture of the ground, the stillness of the air, the brightness that does not glare but settles quietly over the land. In a tradition that often spoke of divine presence in large and distant terms, Elysium feels intimate. It is not overwhelming, it is hospitable. The beauty is not sharp or theatrical. It is steady like a long afternoon. And so, from the beginning, Elysium is both distant and comforting, a mythic place made of blessing, memory, and the desire for rest. It also reveals something subtle about the Greek imagination itself. The world beyond death did not have to be only darkness in order to be meaningful. By placing a calm and beautiful region at the edges of the cosmos, the poets gave form to hope without fully denying mortality. Elysium does not erase the fact of death. Instead, it places a gentle border around it. That border would be reinterpreted many times. Sometimes it is a reward for heroes. Sometimes it is a gift from the gods. Sometimes it is simply the end point of a fortunate life. But in all of these versions, the tone remains unusually soft. Even when later traditions elaborate the place, they rarely lose the quiet spaciousness of the original idea. Elysium stays near the edge of sleep, near the edge of sunset, near the edge of a thought that is almost too peaceful to name. The endurance of the concept also tells us something about ancient storytelling itself. Greek poets were not building a single, rigid afterlife system. They were weaving images that could be remembered, repeated, and reshaped. Elysium belongs to that kind of myth-making. It is less like a doctrine than like a recurring dream, one that different generations could enter in slightly different ways while still recognizing its familiar calm. In that sense, Elysium is not only a destination in myth, it is also a tone. It is the tone of protection, of distance from harm, of a horizon that does not threaten. That may be why it continues to feel so inviting even now. The name suggests a place where the world has become quieter, where the air has softened, and where the mind can finally stop bracing against the next hardship. For ancient audiences, that promise would have felt precious. Life in the Greek world could be beautiful, but it was also exposed to sudden loss, instability, and the constant nearness of change. Elysium answered that vulnerability with an image of permanence. Not rigid permanence, but the kind that feels alive. A season that never turns severe, a field that never hardens, a peace that does not need to be defended. And because the sources never completely settle every detail, Elysium retains a little openness, a little breath. It can be read as island, meadow, shore, or simply blessed realm. That openness invites contemplation rather than certainty. It lets the listener settle into the image without feeling confined by it. In the end, the earliest Elysium is memorable not because it is heavily defined, but because it is gently held in place. It is a place beyond ordinary suffering, beyond the noise of judgment, beyond the harshness of the living world. It stands as one of the oldest and softest answers to the human wish for rest, and its quiet beauty is part of why it has never entirely faded from memory. In Homer's Odyssey, the clearest early description of Elysium appears in a passage that feels unusually calm for epic poetry. The hero is told of a place at the edge of the earth where life is easy for certain favored people, and the language itself seems to soften as he listens. There, the west wind blows gently from Oceanus, and the climate is so mild that the inhabitants do not need to face the harshness familiar to mortals. The emphasis on air and weather is important. Ancient Greek literature often used climate as a moral and emotional signal. Good places were fair, balanced, and softly lit. Even when the world of the poem is full of struggle, this one place is described as though it has been set apart from all strain. This Homeric version of Elysium is especially interesting because it seems less like a religion of judgment and more like a gift from the gods. It is associated with divine kinship, not with universal law. Menelaus, for example, is told that he has a special destiny because he is the son-in-law of Zeus. That detail reveals how heroic status could shape one's afterlife in early Greek thought. Honor in life might become comfort after death. In this older imagination, the afterlife is not distributed evenly. It is connected to relationship, lineage, and favor, all of which mattered deeply in the heroic world. What one received beyond death could reflect one's closeness to the divine during life. The location of this Elysium is not inside Hades in the later sense. It is placed near the ends of the earth, beyond ordinary geography. To ancient listeners, that made perfect sense. The world was not always imagined as neatly enclosed. There were margins, edges, and distant horizons where the known dissolved into divine possibility. These borderlands were especially useful in myth because they allowed poets to place extraordinary things somewhere just out of reach, in a space that felt both real and unreachable. Elysium in this early setting belongs to that kind of landscape, not entirely celestial, not subterranean, but remote enough to feel protected from the burdens of ordinary life. Homer's Elysium also reflects a world still flexible in its beliefs. Greek religion was never one single doctrine. Different poems, cities, and later philosophers shaped different answers to death. Elysium in this period is one answer among many, and a very gentle one. Some traditions emphasized shadowy continuation, some emphasized punishment, and some offered only uncertainty. Against that backdrop, the Homeric vision stands out because it does not threaten or moralize. It simply suggests that for some, existence can continue in ease. That softness is part of why the passage has remained memorable for so long. It offers calm without requiring explanation. The idea of no snow, no rain, and no severe winter should not be read only as poetic decoration. It expresses an ancient ideal of untroubled balance. Nature itself becomes kind there. The land no longer resists human beings, instead it seems to agree with them. In the lived world of ancient Greece, weather could determine comfort, labor, travel, harvest, and survival. So a place without harsh seasons was more than pleasant. It was almost beyond ordinary blessing. To imagine a realm where the sky never turns cruel is to imagine a life no longer interrupted by the basic discomforts that shape mortal experience. The promise is quiet, but it is profound. That image is quietly powerful because it turns eternal rest into eternal ease. The soul is not tormented, tested, or purified by hardship. It simply lives in a place where hardship never arrives. This is one of the reasons Elysium can feel almost dreamlike in the Homeric imagination. It is not a dramatic reward with trumpets and judgment scenes. It is a release from friction. The body, the land, and the atmosphere are all in agreement. Nothing presses too hard. Nothing wounds. The old anxiety of living in a precarious world seems to have been set down at the threshold. Later readers sometimes imagine Elysium as a paradise in a Christian sense, but Homer's vision is more restrained and more aristocratic. It is not universal salvation. It is fortunate removal from suffering. That difference helps explain why the place retained a sense of distance and privilege. The emphasis is not on redemption for all, but on exceptional fortune for a few. This makes the passage feel deeply rooted in the values of the heroic age, where rank, alliance, and divine favor mattered greatly. The afterlife here is not a leveling force. It preserves the logic of distinction in a gentler form. There is also a subtle emotional function in the passage. Homer does not linger on Elysium for very long, and that brevity may be part of its magic. It is glimpsed as a promise, not fully inspected. The mind fills in the rest with green openness, soft winds, and a sky that never darkens too heavily. This economy of description leaves space for imagination, and that space is part of the atmosphere. If the poet had explained every detail, the place might have become smaller. Instead, it remains expansive in the reader's mind, like a distant field seen through morning haze. Its silence is not emptiness, it is room. In this way, Elysium becomes a poetic pause in the epic tradition, a place where the noise of battle falls away and the imagination can rest. The Odyssey is a poem of travel, danger, cunning, loss, and return. Within that restless movement, Elysium appears almost like a held breath. It interrupts the usual rhythm of hardship with a vision of stillness. And because the poem itself is so full of motion, the contrast makes the calm feel deeper. Ancient listeners would have heard the passage not only as geography, but as emotional relief. It is one of those rare moments when the epic world seems to exhale. And even now, the ancient lines still carry that same stillness, as if a page from the Odyssey had opened into quiet air. The words seem to drift rather than strike. They suggest distance without loneliness, softness without vagueness, and a kind of peace that does not need to announce itself. That may be one reason the Homeric Elysium continues to matter. It is not merely an early version of heaven, it is an early version of rest. The Homeric Elysium also helped shape later ideas of blessed geography. Writers could place it on islands at the edge of the sea or beneath the setting sun, but the emotional core remained the same, a remote, gentle place where the chosen dead continue in comfort. In later Greek and Roman literature, the setting could shift, but the feeling often remained tethered to this first calm image. Geographers of myth like to move sacred places around, but Elysium's essential character stayed consistent, separate, favorable, and softened by divine weather. It became a kind of map of longing as much as a map of belief. So the Odyssey gives us not just a name, but a mood. It teaches us that Elysium was first known as an atmosphere of perfect calm. That atmosphere matters because it shows how ancient people could imagine blessedness in sensory terms. Not just light, not just reward, but air, wind, and climate all working together in harmony. The place is not defined by architecture or ceremony. It is defined by the feeling of being untroubled by the world. For a sleep video script, that is especially fitting, because the oldest Elysium is already quiet in a way that almost asks to be listened to with closed eyes. The calmness of Homer's description may also reflect a broader ancient fascination with the boundary between the known and the divine. In epic poetry, the edges of the earth are never merely empty. They are places where ordinary rules begin to loosen. Sea mists gather there, winds behave differently, and time itself can feel less strict. By placing Elysium at such a margin, Homer makes it part of a larger mythic pattern. The farther a place lies from common life, the more likely it is to host wonders. Yet unlike many distant mythic regions, this one is not dangerous. It is welcoming. That reversal gives it a special kind of serenity. The west wind in the passage is also worth slowing down to consider. In ancient Mediterranean thought, winds were not simply weather events. They were forces with personality, direction, and significance. A gentle wind could suggest favor, ease, and seasonal relief. The wind from the west, in particular, had associations with softness and transition. It is the kind of breeze that arrives after heat, after labor, after a long stretch of exertion. In the context of Elysium, it helps create the sense that everything there has already been smoothed out. Even the air seems to know how to be kind. Oceanus, too, adds to the older texture of the passage. In Homeric thought, Oceanus is not just a body of water in a modern geographic sense. It is a vast boundary, a surrounding stream or world-encircling element that marks the limit of human knowledge. To say that Elysium lies near Oceanus is to place it close to the edge of existence as the Greeks imagined it. This is not a domestic place, not a city, not a field within the normal order. It is a threshold zone, belonging partly to mythic geography and partly to divine imagination. That edge-of-the-world quality gives the passage a floating, almost suspended feeling. The people who inhabit Elysium in Homer are not described as struggling to earn their reward. They simply arrive there by a kind of granted exception. This matters because it shows that early Greek thought about the afterlife could be less about moral accounting than about exceptional destiny. A great king, a hero, or someone closely connected to the divine might be set apart from ordinary fate. In the Homeric world, greatness in life often continues into death as a different mode of existence. The same social values that shape the living world still quietly extend beyond it, though they are softened into peace. At the same time, the passage does not build a full doctrine from that idea. Homer is not writing a theology of salvation. He is offering an image, brief but memorable, of what a blessed continuation might resemble. That restraint leaves the concept open. Later thinkers could expand it, reinterpret it, or relocate it. Poets of later centuries would make Elysium richer, stranger, and more elaborate, but the seed is already here in Homer, a tranquil place far away, preserved by divine weather and granted to those with special standing. There is something deeply human in the fact that the earliest Elysium is described through comfort rather than spectacle. It does not dazzle with gold walls or loud ceremonies. It promises no triumphal procession. Instead, it offers the simple absence of hardship. In many ways, this makes it feel more intimate than later, more ornate visions of paradise. It speaks to an old and enduring desire, not always for glory but for ease. The longing to rest without fear may be older than any formal religion. Homer captures that longing with remarkable delicacy. This is why the passage continues to feel almost soothing in the modern ear. The ancient world can sometimes seem harsh, severe, and full of struggle, yet here we find a rare image of gentleness. The wind is kind, The climate is kind, the land is kind, even the distance feels kind because it protects rather than isolates. Elysium in this first telling is not a mystery to be solved. It is a quiet answer to the human wish for a place where everything finally becomes easy. By the early 2nd century, Elysium had become one of those ideas that seemed to gather new meaning every time someone spoke it aloud. It was no longer only a distant meadow at the edge of the afterlife, but a kind of moral horizon, a place people imagined when they wanted to believe that goodness could outlast suffering. Ancient poets did not always agree on where it was, or even what sort of place it truly was. Some described bright fields, others soft islands, and a few favored a more dreamlike vision, where the dead moved without weight through an endless, gentle season. What matters most is that Elysium began to feel less like a map location and more like a promise. In a world often shaped by war, illness, and short lives, the thought of a calm continuation would have carried a quiet comfort. There is something tender in that, the way a culture can build a paradise not from abundance alone, but from the longing for rest. The old stories suggest sunlight that never harshens, air that never burns, and land that asks for nothing. Even if these descriptions vary, they all share the same soothing impulse, to imagine an ending that does not feel like an ending at all. And so Elysium moved through time as both destination and consolation, a place of blessed permanence slowly deepening in the human imagination. In some Roman authors, Elysium was woven more tightly into ideas of reward and virtue than it had been in earlier Greek traditions. This shift matters because it shows how flexible the myth could be. The Romans were often interested in order, duty, and the moral weight of service, so a paradise reserved for worthy souls fit naturally into their literary world. In epic poetry, especially, Elysium is sometimes presented as a place for heroes, leaders, or those who had served the greater good in life. Yet even there the mood is not stern. The landscape remains peaceful, green, and luminous, as if morality itself has become a kind of weather. Virgil's famous vision is especially gentle, with its breezes and quiet groves, and later readers often remembered the feeling more than the details. It is worth noticing how such passages work on the mind. They do not merely describe a place, they slow the breathing. The language tends to soften around the edges, lingering on shade, song, and stillness. This may be one reason Elysium endured so well in literary memory. It could be moral without becoming severe, heavenly without losing the touch of the earth. It offered a reward that still felt natural, as if the soul were simply being returned to a deeper, calmer version of the world it had always known. There is also an intriguing uncertainty in ancient sources about who exactly could enter Elysium. Some texts reserve it for the exceptionally noble or heroic, while others open it more broadly to those favored by the gods. In a few traditions, a person might reach it after death through divine approval rather than through any clearly defined earthly achievement. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the myth so much as part of its atmosphere. Elysium never had the hard borders of a legal code. It was always partly remembered, partly imagined, and partly inherited from older stories that had shifted over time. That flexibility allowed it to serve many emotional needs. A soldier might hear in it the reward of valor. A philosopher might hear the possibility of purified existence. A grieving family might hear only peace. The gate to Elysium, then, was not always pictured as a gate at all. Sometimes it was a transition in light, a change in the quality of the air, or a passage across water. In some accounts, the blessed enter after being judged. In others, their nearness to the divine is enough. The lack of fixed boundaries makes the place feel quieter, almost more believable, because it resembles a dream that has not yet decided its final shape. And perhaps that is part of the enduring comfort. Elysium can be generous without needing to explain itself too strictly. The association between Elysium and islands is especially calming, and perhaps that is why later cultures kept returning to it. An island suggests distance, but also protection. It is surrounded, sheltered, and separated from the noise of ordinary life. In ancient imagination, the setting of the blessed was sometimes placed beyond the western sea, where the sun slips away and the day ends in a soft gold wash. The idea of an island of the dead may have drawn strength from real geography, since the Mediterranean world was full of remote shores and hidden inlets that could seem like thresholds between familiar and unknown. But the symbolic power goes beyond geography. An island lets the mind picture bounded serenity. There are no endless roads, no crowded markets, no sudden intrusion from the outside world, only the rhythmic meeting of water and land, repeated without urgency. Writers who favored this version of Elysium often emphasized distance in a gentle way, not as exile but as release. The blessed are not abandoned there, they are set apart. Even the sea around the island can feel restful in such descriptions, a quiet blue margin that keeps the world from pressing too closely. It is easy to see why this image persisted. There is comfort in imagining paradise not as a glittering palace, but as a secluded shore where the soul can finally hear itself think. Another subtle feature of Elysium is its relationship to memory. Unlike some visions of the afterlife that promise complete erasure or radical transformation, Elysium often remains a place where identity continues, softened but not lost. The heroes and righteous dead are still themselves, still capable of walking, conversing, and perhaps remembering their lives among the living. This continuity gives the myth a very particular warmth. It suggests that peace does not require the abandonment of everything human. Instead, the self is carried forward into a better climate. In some accounts, old friendships continue there. In others, famous figures dwell together in serene companionship, as if history itself has been carefully dimmed and arranged into a quieter form. The notion is especially moving because it allows for recognition. A loved one is not transformed into something unapproachable. They are simply no longer burdened by pain. Ancient writers did not always spell this out directly, but the mood of the tradition implies it. Elysium is often imagined as a place where remembrance no longer hurts. The past can exist there without sharpness. This is a deeply human idea, and perhaps one of the reasons the myth has survived so long. It offers not only rest, but continuity without suffering, which is a very gentle promise indeed. By late antiquity, Elysium had begun to interact with broader religious and philosophical ideas about the soul. Thinkers who were interested in immortality, judgment, purification, or divine ascent often used language that echoed the older myth, even when they were not directly repeating it. The boundaries between literature, philosophy, and spiritual speculation were often soft in the ancient world. A paradise of the blessed could blend into a realm of contemplation, or a refined spiritual dwelling place, depending on the writer. This blending is one reason Elysium is so difficult to pin down. It is not a single doctrine, but a luminous cluster of ideas. Some traditions treated it as a reward after a specific kind of life. Others saw it as one stage among many. In philosophical contexts, the soul's final condition might be described as a kind of calm clarity, a release from the confusions of embodiment. Elysium could be used as a poetic shorthand for that state, carrying emotional weight even when the metaphysics were uncertain. The ancient mind did not always insist on strict categories the way modern scholarship might. It was content to let multiple possibilities hover together. And in that hovering, Elysium gained a special softness. It became less a destination with one meaning than a serene image through which many people could think about survival, justice, and peace. The visual language of Elysium also deserves attention, because it is so often composed of soothing natural elements rather than grand architecture. Fields, groves, fountains, flowers, and perpetual spring appear again and again in the tradition. This is not accidental. Ancient audiences understood the power of landscape to shape mood. A meadow after rain, a shaded path, a stream moving over bright stones. These are not simply details, but forms of emotional guidance. Elysium is usually not overloaded with spectacle. It is not a place of noise or crowding. Even when it contains famous figures or heroic company, the surroundings remain spacious and calm. There is often room to breathe. The flowers do not seem decorative so much as alive with ease, and the trees appear to stand in quiet mutuality, offering shade without threat. Scholars have sometimes noted that such imagery may reflect elite ideals of leisure and cultivated retreat, but it also carries a universal appeal. Most people, regardless of status, can recognize the comfort of a soft landscape after labor. Ancient poets may have inherited formal conventions, yet the effect still feels intimate. Elysium is beautiful in a way that lowers the pulse. It does not demand attention so much as invite it gently. And in that invitation, the myth creates a very old and very enduring kind of rest. It is also worth noticing how Elysium stands in contrast to more fearful regions of the underworld, not through dramatic opposition alone, but through tone. In many ancient systems, the dead did not simply go to one place. There were differentiated realms, some dark, some neutral, some blessed. Elysium gains much of its meaning by comparison with what lies beside or below it. The contrast is not always violent. It can be as simple as shadow versus light, burden versus ease, labor versus lingering calm. This balance made the afterlife feel morally intelligible to ancient audiences, even if the details remained poetically fluid. A harsh existence could be followed by a gentler one, and that possibility itself would have had emotional value. Yet the gentleness is never shallow. The pleasures of Elysium are often described with restraint, avoiding excess. There is no anxious attempt to overwhelm the reader with splendor. Instead, the tradition suggests that true blessedness may be quiet. A peaceful place does not need to shout. This understated quality helps explain why Elysium can feel so restful to modern readers as well. It is not a paradise of glittering display. It is a paradise of reduced friction, where the soul no longer braces itself against the world. That idea can be almost physically soothing to consider, like settling into a room where every sound has softened. One of the more interesting scholarly questions concerns whether Elysium was ever thought of as reachable only after a heroic death, or whether the manner of death was less important than the moral quality of life. Ancient sources do not offer a single answer, and the disagreement itself is revealing. Some heroic traditions lean toward exceptional entrance, as though Elysium were a rare honor reserved for those touched specially by fate. But other strands seem more generous, suggesting that divine favor or righteousness may matter more than the exact circumstances of death. This uncertainty reflects a broader ancient tension between fate and merit. Did a person earn paradise, receive it, or somehow inherit it from the gods? The myth allows the question to remain open. That openness softens the moral atmosphere. It lets Elysium exist as a space of grace rather than a strict ledger. And grace is a calming concept because it does not require perfect calculation. It offers relief where logic might otherwise press too hard. Ancient audiences would have understood this intuitively, even if they never named it that way. The blessed dead are not always described as having passed a test. Sometimes they are simply welcomed, and in that welcoming, the idea of paradise becomes less like a prize and more like a shelter. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. A shelter is something one can enter at last and stop defending oneself. The endurance of Elysium in later art and literature also speaks to its adaptability. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers often reworked the classical past, sometimes merging Elysian imagery with Christian heaven, sometimes using it as a poetic emblem of rest, memory, or beauty. Even when the myth was no longer believed literally, it remained available as a language of consolation. Poets could invoke Elysium to suggest an idealized landscape where sorrow has thinned and music carries more lightly. Painters and decorators drew on its associations with greenery, classical figures, and serene light. The place survived by becoming symbol as well as story. This is not unusual for ancient myths, but Elysium is especially suited to it because it was never narrowly defined. Its softness made it reusable. A strict doctrine can fade when belief changes, but a calm image can persist through centuries. People do not need to agree on theology to recognize the feeling of a blessed meadow at the edge of memory. In this way, Elysium became part of the cultural vocabulary of peace. It could mean rest after suffering, harmony after chaos, or the preservation of noble identity beyond death. The many uses never fully erased the original mythic tenderness. Instead, they layered on top of it, like pale wash over older color, leaving the essential quiet intact. And beneath all of these variations lies a final, quietly moving fact about Elysium. It reveals how deeply the ancient world wanted to imagine happiness as something peaceful rather than ecstatic. The modern mind sometimes expects paradise to be dazzling, overwhelming, endlessly radiant, but Elysium is more often restful than ecstatic. It is a place of balanced air, familiar beauty, and uninterrupted ease. The dead there are not usually depicted in rapture. They are at ease. That difference is important. It suggests an understanding of the good life and the good afterlife as conditions in which tension has been dissolved rather than amplified. The soul is not hurled into spectacle, it is laid down into serenity. Perhaps this is why Elysium continues to feel so emotionally persuasive. It does not promise anything loud, it promises the ending of strain. In its fields and groves, its islands and soft horizons, one can sense a wish that is both ancient and utterly ordinary, to rest safely, to remain oneself, and to be surrounded at last by a world that no longer asks for anything. As Greek religion developed over many centuries, Elysium gradually became more than a distant, happy place at the edge of the world. It came to feel increasingly connected with moral refinement, with the idea that a human life might be weighed after death, and with the destiny of souls following judgment. This is a noticeable shift from the earliest heroic geography, where the emphasis was less on ethical evaluation and more on privileged belonging. In those older stories, Elysium could seem almost like a special refuge reserved for heroes, those who had stood close to the gods through bloodline, favor, or extraordinary fame. But as Greek thought changed, the afterlife itself began to feel more nuanced. Some later traditions imagine that the dead do not simply arrive there because they are noble by birth or beloved by a deity. They may reach it through a more complex process, one that includes assessment, worthiness, and a kind of spiritual sorting. That development reflects a broader Greek interest in the idea that the soul's condition might matter after death, and that a person's inner life could leave an enduring trace beyond the body. One of the most famous later voices in this gradual transformation is Pindar, whose poetry gives Elysium a richer, more elaborate, and more clearly ethical texture. In his work, the blessed dead may dwell there after a life of justice, restraint, and piety. The setting remains beautiful, but now it seems to belong to those who have lived with a cleaner spirit, people whose conduct in the world has prepared them for a different kind of rest. Pindar's Elysium is still a place of ease and radiance, yet it feels more morally charged than Homer's earlier version. There is a quieter seriousness to it. The soul's behavior leaves a mark, and that mark seems to matter. This is not a harsh doctrine, and it does not read like punishment in the later sense. Rather, it suggests that the universe keeps a subtle memory of human goodness, and that certain lives deserve a calmer continuation. In this way, Elysium becomes not only a place of privilege, but also a place of earned peace. This development did not replace the older heroic understanding. Instead, the two versions continued side by side, as Greek tradition so often allowed multiple possibilities to coexist without forcing them into a single system. A listener might imagine Elysium as the reward of kings, warriors, and the favored dead, while also imagining it as a serene destination for souls who had been judged worthy after death. There was no single rigid map that everyone had to accept. Myth remained flexible, and poets could emphasize different aspects depending on their purpose, audience, and mood. That openness is one reason Elysium endured so well. It could be heroic without being exclusive in a modern sense, and ethical without becoming abstract. It could hold several ideas at once: lineage, favor, reward, judgment, rest. Greek imagination often preferred this layered quality to sharp division. The result is a tradition that feels less like a closed doctrine and more like a shared dream slowly taking shape over time. The poetry of reward also gave Elysium a sense of calm that had to be earned rather than merely given. Peace was no longer only a gift bestowed by divine whim. It could also be understood as the proper rest that follows a life lived well. That notion carries a deep human appeal because it answers a longing for order. It suggests that life's unevenness might not be the final word, and that goodness might have a quiet continuation somewhere beyond loss, hardship, and disappointment. In a world where many deaths were sudden, violent, or deeply unjust, this kind of afterlife could feel especially meaningful. It did not erase suffering, but it implied that suffering was not the only reality the cosmos remembered. For an ancient audience, that idea would have been both comforting and morally satisfying. It made the universe seem more balanced, more watchful, and perhaps more kindly arranged than daily experience often suggested. Pindar's language often evokes brightness, refinement, and a more delicate atmosphere than the older heroic field. Some later versions of the tradition describe music, flowered meadows, and a warmth that never becomes oppressive. The setting is often imagined with a softness that invites the listener to linger mentally, as if the mind itself had entered a sheltered landscape. There may be gentle breezes, wide open spaces, and a natural abundance that does not need effort or labor. The atmosphere is not merely pleasant in a simple sense. It feels purified, as though earthly strain has been washed away without violence, leaving only the gentler part of existence behind. This is part of what makes Elysium so enduring in imagination. It is not a place of dramatic spectacle. It is a place where beauty does not need to announce itself. Its ease is part of its grace, and its grace is part of its peace. It is worth remembering, too, that Greek poets did not always separate the blessed afterlife into strict and fixed categories. Elysium could sit beside the Isles of the Blessed, and both could be imagined as parts of a larger realm of fortunate dead. In some tellings, these places seem distinct. In others, they blur together so thoroughly that they are almost different names for the same blessed condition. Ancient myth does not always behave like a system. It behaves more like a shoreline, constantly shifting under the pressure of many storytellers. At times, these regions feel almost like overlapping layers of the same dream, each version preserving a different mood. One may be more heroic, another more pastoral, another more remote and radiant. Rather than weakening the tradition, this variety gives it depth. It allows Elysium to remain suggestive instead of overdefined. There is room in it for wonder, ambiguity, and the pleasant uncertainty that often accompanies ancient poetry. The important point is that Greek culture kept returning to the question of how virtue might continue beyond death. Elysium offered one elegant answer, not as a strict theology, but as an imaginative possibility. It said that a soul might not simply vanish into darkness or become a meaningless shade. It might receive a gentler horizon, a calmer form of existence, a place where time itself seems softened. The Greeks, especially in later periods, often explored afterlife ideas with a mix of caution and curiosity. They did not always agree on the details, but they repeatedly asked what becomes of a person after the visible life ends. Elysium gave that question shape. It translated moral hope into landscape. Instead of a philosophical argument, it offered fields, light breezes, and rest. And because it was visual and sensory, it could be carried easily in memory and poetry. For ancient audiences, this was not only comforting in an emotional sense, it was meaningful in a cultural one. It suggested that the cosmos could distinguish between lives, that divine order was attentive, and that goodness, piety, courage, or favor might survive in a quieter register after death. Even when the criteria remained uncertain, the principle felt important. A human life was not necessarily dissolved into sameness. There could be differences, continuities, recognitions. That idea helped Elysium function as a place of ethical imagination as much as a place of rest. It did not need to be fully defined to do its work. Its beauty lay partly in its suggestion that some form of care persists beyond the moment of death, and that the universe may hold memory with a gentler hand than the living world usually does. The difference between reward and punishment is central here, but so is proportion. Elysium is not a blazing heaven in the later religious sense. It is not a place of ecstatic spectacle, nor is it usually described as overwhelming or fearful. Its beauty is measured and spacious. Its pleasures are often pastoral rather than triumphant: cool breezes, fertile ground, soft light, and a steady peace that does not exhaust itself. This restraint gives the place a special dignity. It does not need intensity to be profound. In fact, its calmness is part of what makes it feel true to the ancient imagination. Greek myth often valued balance, measure, and the harmony of form. Elysium fits that sensibility well. It does not shout about bliss. It simply offers it quietly, with confidence and ease, as though happiness were most complete when it did not strain to be seen. That same restraint gives Elysium an almost meditative quality. The mind can picture it without tension. One imagines open fields, clear air, and a world where nothing urgent intrudes. There is no labor pressing in from the edges, no harsh weather, no clamor of ordinary concern. Even time seems to slow there. For a sleep documentary, that atmosphere is especially fitting because the place itself suggests the soft release of effort. Elysium is not a scene of conflict overcome by force. It is a scene of settling, of arrival, of the body and soul easing into a kind of spacious stillness. The appeal is not only in what it contains, but in what it removes: strain, noise, and the relentless friction of mortal life. In that sense, it resembles a deep and restful exhale. In the later classical imagination, to reach Elysium was to have escaped the harsher contours of fate. Yet even then, the place retained a tenderness that made it feel more inviting than remote. It was not a conquest, it was an arrival. That distinction matters. The blessed dead do not storm Elysium, seize it, or earn it through struggle in the ordinary heroic sense. They come to it, and the word itself feels quieter than victory. Arrival implies belonging, recognition, and ease. It suggests that the place was waiting, or at least open to those who had the right to enter. This is part of Elysium's enduring emotional power. It is not about dominance, it is about being received. For a culture so attentive to honor, status, and destiny, that softer notion of welcome must have carried great appeal. That sense of arriving somewhere kind after a long journey remains one of the deepest reasons the name still feels restful today. Even now, outside the ancient world, Elysium can suggest a place beyond burden, a shoreline of peace after a difficult crossing. The image has survived because it speaks to something persistent in human thought, the hope that beyond struggle there may be a gentler order, and that the final home of the worthy, the favored, or the fortunate might be marked not by brilliance alone, but by quiet mercy. A major turning point in the story of Elysium comes with the figure of the poet Virgil, whose Roman epic, the Aeneid, reimagined the Greek underworld for an audience shaped by Rome's own ideas about duty, memory, and destiny. In Virgil's hands, the blessed afterlife is no longer only a distant patch of perfect earth at the edge of the world. It becomes part of a carefully ordered landscape of death, where meaning is arranged almost like architecture. The Romans inherited the Greek idea, but they did not simply repeat it. They sharpened it, formalized it, and gave it a new kind of gravity. In the Aeneid, Elysium appears as a distinct and luminous region within the underworld, separated from darker zones by rivers, guardians, and symbolic boundaries that feel both physical and ceremonial. This is a significant development in the history of the myth. Rather than existing only as a remote blessed plane beyond the normal world, Elysium now becomes nested within the larger realm of the dead. The underworld becomes organized, almost like a city with different districts, each reflecting a different condition of the soul. There are places of punishment, places of waiting, and places of peace, and this arrangement gives the whole afterlife a quiet order that the older Greek traditions only hinted at. Virgil's Elysium is a place of song, peace, and noble remembrance. Heroes rest there, as do souls singled out for purity, achievement, or a kind of morally refined goodness. The atmosphere is richly Roman, with a sense of dignity, ritual, and state-like calm, yet it still carries the Greek dream of meadow light and mild air, of soft fields where the dead can move without burden. Virgil seems to preserve the tenderness of the old myth while surrounding it with a more disciplined emotional world. One reason Virgil's version became so influential is that it linked Elysium to moral and civic memory. The dead are not only resting in silence, they are remembering, waiting, and sometimes preparing for return. In some sections of the epic, souls undergo purification before being reborn into life again. That means Elysium is not always the final stopping point. It can be part of a larger cycle, a pause in the rhythm of existence rather than an ending. For a culture like Rome, which valued continuity, inheritance, and the transmission of virtue, this was especially powerful. This cyclical element is very different from the simpler Homeric picture. It suggests that peace after death may be temporary, or at least woven into a broader process of renewal. The soul is not merely rewarded and then left there forever. It may be cleansed, instructed, and eventually returned. Roman readers, with their fascination for duty, fate, and the ongoing life of the city, would have found this deeply compelling. Even in death there is still structure. Even in peace there is movement. Virgil also helped make Elysium visually vivid for later centuries. His language gave the place contours that poets, painters, and theologians could imagine with unusual clarity. Medieval and Renaissance readers absorbed his lines and carried them forward into art, meditation, and literature. The place began to glow not only in myth, but in cultural memory. It became one of those rare afterlife images that can be passed from one age to another without losing its softness. At the same time, Virgil's Elysium remains restrained. It is not a realm of excess, noise, or ecstatic disorder. It is a refined resting place, a landscape of ordered calm. Even the joy there seems composed, as if peace itself has learned to speak in a low voice. The blessed dead do not need to proclaim their happiness. It is present in the air, in the spacing of the fields, in the way the whole region seems to breathe slowly. That is one of the enduring pleasures of the idea. It allows beauty without noise. It allows peace with structure. It turns the afterlife into a place where form itself becomes gentle. There is no harsh contradiction between order and comfort here. The order is the comfort. The boundaries are part of the blessing. The Roman adaptation also reminds us that Elysium was never a frozen relic, never a single static picture preserved unchanged from one generation to the next. Every age reread it according to its own needs. For the Greeks, it could be heroic, ethical, or almost geographical in its remoteness. For the Romans, it could become moral, imperial, and cyclical. In each version, however, it kept the same essential softness, the same invitation to imagine a world where pain has been set down. Later commentators often notice that Elysium in Virgil is not exactly the same as paradise in later religious traditions, though it can feel like a distant ancestor to them. It is more literary than theological, more atmospheric than doctrinal. It exists in the space where language can suggest comfort without over-defining it. That is one reason it remains so approachable. It does not insist, it implies, and that vagueness may be the reason it endured so well. The more precisely a place of peace is described, the more it risks becoming ordinary. Elysium stays dreamlike because it never loses its open edges. It is always clear enough to enter the imagination, yet soft enough to remain just beyond it. It invites quiet attention rather than certainty. As Virgil describes it, the blessed dead gather, converse, and live within a hush of remembrance. There is company there, but not interruption. There is life there, but not struggle. It is one of the most quietly moving visions in all of classical literature, because it does not try to overwhelm the reader. It simply opens a calm space and lets the mind rest in it for a while. Even now, many people encounter Elysium first through Virgil, and that means the Roman poet helped fix the image of a peaceful afterlife for readers far beyond his own time. His version became the one that echoed through schoolrooms, commentaries, translations, and the long habits of literary memory. In some sense, the later history of Elysium is inseparable from the sound of Virgil's Latin, measured and grave, carrying the blessed dead into a landscape of light. The name itself then began to carry a double echo, the old Greek field and the Roman underworld chamber, both joined by the same desire for rest. One image suggests open land and distant brightness. The other suggests an ordered interior, a realm with boundaries and passages. Together they create a fuller myth, one that can feel both expansive and intimate. That joining is part of the reason Elysium feels so enduringly human. It can be reshaped but never emptied. Across cultures and centuries, people have returned to it because it holds a simple wish in a form that never becomes crude. It says that the dead may still dwell in peace, and that peace may still have beauty, memory, and a place to stand. A further reason Virgil's Elysium mattered is that it fit neatly into Roman habits of reading the world through hierarchy and sequence. Rome was a civilization deeply attentive to rank, ritual, succession, and proper arrangement. In the Aeneid, even the afterlife seems to reflect that sensibility. The dead are not all placed in the same condition. Their destination depends on the kind of life they lived, the forces that shaped them, and the mysterious judgments of the cosmos. This makes the underworld feel less like an amorphous shadowland and more like a system. Yet even within that system, Virgil does not make Elysium cold. He gives it warmth through pastoral details, green fields, gentle breezes, shaded groves, and the sound of voices at rest. The effect is almost musical. One can imagine the dead speaking softly, as if not to disturb the balance of the place. This is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of ease. The Roman underworld also carries a subtle sense of public memory. In Virgil, the blessed may include the famous and the worthy, but their fame is no longer a matter of earthly applause. It is transfigured into calm recognition. Their names and deeds are not erased, but they are no longer urgent. The transition from historical life to peaceful afterlife becomes a kind of dignified cooling, as though fame itself is finally allowed to rest. That idea would prove deeply attractive in later literature, where Elysium often appears as a place for the noble dead, the innocent dead, or the beloved dead who deserve a gentler continuation. Virgil did not invent every element of this, but he refined the arrangement and gave it emotional clarity. His influence helped turn Elysium into something that could be remembered almost like a literary room, a place one returns to in the mind. The cyclical structure in the Aeneid also adds a philosophical undertone. If souls can be purified and sent back into life, then death is not simply a wall. It is a threshold within a larger pattern. That pattern is difficult to picture fully, and Virgil does not press it into rigid explanation. He leaves it partly mysterious, which is fitting. The dead do not become less mysterious simply because they are given a route. This is one of the places where the Roman and Greek traditions quietly meet. Greek myth often preserves uncertainty by multiplying stories. Roman poetry preserves uncertainty by arranging those stories into a more legible shape. The result is not less mysterious, but differently mysterious. Elysium remains a dream, though now a dream with corridors. It is also worth remembering that Virgil was writing under the shadow of empire, civil conflict, and political transformation. The Aeneid is not only a mythic poem, it is also a work of cultural meaning, trying to give Rome a destiny that feels ancient, lawful, and spiritually grounded. Elysium participates in that larger effort. It becomes part of a universe where justice, memory, and order all have a place, even beyond death. The calm of the afterlife mirrors the ideal calm of a well-ordered world. Still, Virgil does not flatten the human experience into propaganda. The emotional texture of Elysium remains tender, almost melancholy. The blessed dead are safe, but they are also separated. Their peace comes with distance. That faint sadness is part of the beauty. It reminds the reader that rest is precious precisely because life is fragile and brief. Later ages often found in Virgil a bridge between pagan myth and more spiritual ideas of reward after death. While Elysium is not the same as heaven, and should not be mistaken for it, the resemblance in mood was enough to make it linger in the imagination. The vision of a peaceful realm beyond suffering is remarkably portable. It crosses borders of language and belief because it answers a basic longing with unusual gentleness. And yet the power of Elysium in Virgil is not just that it promises comfort, it is that it frames comfort as something orderly, shared, and dignified. The dead are not lost in an abstract bliss. They inhabit a place that still feels like a landscape, still feels like a world. That concreteness helps the idea survive. We can picture it. We can walk through it in our minds. The fields of Elysium, then, are both an inheritance and a reinvention. Virgil receives them from older Greek imagination, but he also gives them a Roman stillness. The result is a version of the myth that feels poised between motion and rest. Souls may arrive there after struggle, and some may leave again in renewal, but the place itself remains calm. It is a sanctuary within process. This quiet balance is perhaps why the image has never fully faded. Elysium in Virgil is not merely an artifact of ancient literature. It is a model of how human beings imagine rest when they want it to remain meaningful. It must be beautiful but not overwhelming. It must be peaceful but not empty. It must suggest an ending without sounding like disappearance. So when readers encounter Elysium through Virgil, they are meeting one of the most durable shapes in the history of the afterlife. It is a place made of inheritance, refinement, and memory. It glows softly at the center of a world of the dead, and it does so without demanding too much light. Not every ancient writer imagined Elysium in exactly the same way, and that variety is one of the most revealing things about it. Some placed it at the world's far edge, where the known earth thinned into mystery, and the sun seemed to linger a little longer. Others made it a distinct section of the underworld, not a separate land above or beyond death, but a protected region within death's larger geography. Some tied it especially to heroes, men and women marked by extraordinary deeds or divine favor, while others opened it more broadly to the virtuous dead, those whose lives had been just pious or orderly enough to deserve a gentler fate. The concept remained alive because it could move without breaking. It did not depend on a single map. It could shift with the needs of poetry, ritual, and philosophy while still feeling recognizably itself. Ancient commentators and later scholars tried to reconcile these versions, but the truth is that Greek and Roman religious imagination often preferred layered possibilities over one final definition. A place could be both a destination and a condition, both a landscape and a moral idea. Elysium was not a problem to be solved once and for all. It was a field of meanings that could be approached from several directions. One author might describe it as a reward for noble souls, another as a blessed pasture, another as a remote island, and all of them could be participating in the same long tradition of hopeful thinking. The contradictions were not always experienced as contradictions. They were often treated as different ways of speaking about the same quiet promise. This is one reason the place appears in both mythic and philosophical writing. Myths gave it color, movement, and familiar shapes: meadows, trees, streams, and softened light. Philosophy gave it reflection, caution, and a language for the soul's condition. Once thinkers began asking whether the soul was immortal, purified, or destined for return, Elysium became useful as a symbol of the soul's calmer state. It could stand for reward, repose, transformation, or a step in a larger journey. In that sense, it was never only a location. It was also a way of imagining what happens when life's rough edges are finally smoothed out, when struggle is no longer the governing rhythm and a different kind of existence begins. Plato's dialogues, especially those dealing with the afterlife and judgment, helped deepen the philosophical resonance around blessed destinations. Even when he did not always use Elysium in a strict technical sense, his world made room for souls to be rewarded or purified according to their lives. That intellectual atmosphere enriched the older poetic image. It encouraged later readers to think of the afterlife not merely as a shadowy continuation of earthly existence, but as something ordered by justice, proportion, and inner condition. In that environment, Elysium could be understood as a place where the soul's burdens had lightened. It was still part of the ancient imagination, but it now carried a more contemplative weight. The idea of selective peace is also psychologically important. Elysium answers a human question that is very old and very persistent. If life is uneven, can there be a place where the imbalance is corrected? Ancient writers offered many answers, some severe, some consoling, some deliberately ambiguous. But Elysium remained one of the calmest. It did not rely on punishment to define itself. It did not need dramatic fire or terrifying judgment to feel meaningful. Instead, it suggested that peace could be earned, received, or simply entered after the hardships of mortal life. For readers and listeners over many centuries, that gentle possibility mattered. It made room for the hope that the soul might finally rest without ceasing to be itself. Its beauty is often described in familiar natural terms, which made it feel less like an abstraction and more like an idealized countryside. Meads, groves, light breezes, and fragrant air appear again and again. These are not accidental details. They ground the concept in sensory peace. Ancient people knew fields, orchards, water, and shade from daily life, so these images carried immediate emotional clarity. The afterlife did not have to be rendered as an impossible architecture. It could be imagined as the most welcoming version of the world already known. Soft grass underfoot, a cool wind through leaves, clear streams, and open space without threat. Such descriptions invite the listener to relax into the scene. They make eternity feel for a moment like an afternoon that does not hurry. In later literary traditions, especially among poets who loved the classical past, Elysium could become a shorthand for any ideal realm of serenity, whether literal or symbolic. A garden might be called Elysian. A quiet evening could be compared to Elysium. The word began to travel beyond religion. It entered the language of art, landscape, and inward mood, where it could evoke refinement without needing detailed explanation. Writers used it because the sound of the word itself seemed to carry ease and distance. It suggested something just beyond ordinary reach, but not so remote that it lost warmth. That balance made it especially durable. It could praise beauty without over-explaining it. That linguistic afterlife is important. It shows how myth moves into culture. A sacred place becomes a metaphor, and the metaphor becomes part of ordinary beauty language. Once that happens, the original story no longer has to remain fixed in one religious system. It can live in poetry, in garden design, in polite speech, and in the private imagination of people who may know little about ancient ritual. Elysium becomes a word for pleasant completion, for a setting that seems to outlast the moment in which it is seen. In that way, it travels far beyond the old tales while still carrying their soft brightness. In some Roman and post-Roman uses, Elysium could also merge with broader ideas of the blessed dead, fields of reward, or the peace of the righteous. The original boundaries softened, but the name kept its glow. That glow matters because it makes the word feel less like a technical label and more like a surviving piece of emotional inheritance. Even when the theological frameworks changed, the image of a blessed resting place remained attractive. It could be adapted to new moral systems without losing its essential calm. The exact rules might differ from one era to another, but the desire for a humane destination after death persisted. Modern readers sometimes miss how important geographic imagination was in all this. To place Elysium somewhere, west under the earth beyond the sea, was to make death imaginable. Ancient people used landscape to think about the soul. A destination far away can be comforting because it turns mystery into direction. Instead of an infinite blank, there is a path, even if only a mythic one. Instead of disappearance, there is arrival. This does not remove sorrow, but it gives grief an image to hold. In that sense, geography becomes a form of emotional order. The world is large enough to contain a place for the dead, and that place can be spoken of gently. Elysium therefore lives at the edge of cosmography and poetry. It belongs partly to belief, partly to metaphor, and partly to the human need to picture comfort in a form the mind can enter. That is why it has remained so memorable. It is not only a doctrinal claim or an inherited story. It is an imaginative shelter. People return to it not because they have agreed on its boundaries, but because they recognize its emotional shape. It speaks to the wish that existence may have a quiet continuation, a place where the spirit can breathe more easily, and where the world's harshness is finally held at a distance. That is why scholars continue to study it. It is not only a mythic location. It is a map of longing. In ancient evidence, in later commentary, and in the long history of literary reuse, Elysium keeps revealing how deeply human beings need the afterlife to be more than darkness. They want it to be legible, and they want it to be kind. They want to imagine that the good may be gathered somewhere, not erased. Elysium gives shape to that wish without forcing it into one narrow form. It remains open enough to receive different centuries and different beliefs. And like many maps of longing, it never feels completely finished. There is always another shore, another field, another quiet path just beyond the last description. Ancient poets knew this instinctively, which is why their accounts often drift toward evocation rather than precision. The more they tried to describe the place, the more they invited the imagination to continue the scene. A grove leads to a meadow to a stream to a wider light. The mind is allowed to wander without anxiety. The result is not a final answer, but a sustained atmosphere of peace. That openness helps explain why the idea never hardened into a single narrow symbol. It stayed gentle, adaptable, and strangely fresh. It could mean rest after hardship, moral reward, a hero's reward, a philosophical condition, or a beautiful vision of permanence. None of these meanings cancelled the others. Instead, they accumulated around the name like soft layers of light. That is part of its unusual strength. Elysium does not insist. It suggests. It does not command belief so much as invite contemplation. It gives the listener a place to set down their worries for a moment and imagine that serenity might be real. Even now, the word Elysium carries an echo of soft distance, as if it were always half remembered from a dream. That dreamlike quality is one reason it still feels alive. It is not locked in the past, even though it belongs to antiquity. It continues to move through language with the same quiet flexibility that helped it survive in the first place. When people hear it, they may think of a meadow, a resting soul, a blessed horizon, or simply a condition of peace. All of those meanings remain possible. And because they remain possible, the word continues to offer what it offered long ago, a calm place in the imagination where thought can grow still. One of the most intriguing aspects of Elysium is its relationship to the hero cults of ancient Greece. In the Greek world, heroes were not simply fictional figures admired from a distance. They could be dead kings, founders, warriors, or exceptional locals who continue to matter after death through ritual attention, offerings, and memory. Their tombs might become places of respect, and their names could remain active in the life of a city or region. The boundary between a heroic dead person and a sacred ancestor was often soft rather than fixed. Elysium fits naturally into that pattern because it suggests that some beings do not vanish into an indistinct underworld, but continue in a more honored state, as if their significance has been recognized and preserved. This connection helps explain why the blessed afterlife was never only a vague dream of comfort. It was tied to civic religion, local identity, and the everyday work of remembrance. Community might tell stories about its founder, celebrate its protector, or maintain a shrine for a champion, while also imagining that person dwelling in a special realm beyond ordinary death. Myth and ritual were not separate worlds. They could support one another quietly, each making the other feel more plausible. In that sense, Elysium was not just a poetic destination. It belonged to a whole way of thinking in which the dead could remain socially present, especially if they had earned distinction in life. Elysium's association with heroes also reflects a broader Greek tendency to treat excellence as something visible in the world and worthy of memory. Courage, skill, beauty, wisdom, and divine favor all mattered, and they were often imagined as signs that a life had reached beyond the ordinary. In such a culture, death did not necessarily erase excellence. Instead, it could mark the beginning of a new kind of recognition. The afterlife then becomes less like a final disappearance and more like a continuation of status, translated into a calmer and more permanent setting. That idea may have felt especially meaningful in societies where honor, reputation, and public remembrance carried such deep weight. At the same time, not every hero was automatically guaranteed Elysium. The tradition remained selective, and that selectiveness was part of what made it powerful. If everyone could enter without condition, the place would lose some of its symbolic brightness. Ancient myth often depends on scarcity in this way. A rare reward can carry emotional force precisely because it is not universal. It suggests judgment, favor, and a world in which conduct matters. Elysium was therefore not only a pleasant destination, but a mark of distinction, and that distinction helped preserve its special aura across centuries of retelling. The idea of blessed islands may also have echoed the real geography of the Mediterranean. Ancient Greeks knew islands as places of passage, trade, exile, and protection. They also knew the sense of looking toward a distant horizon and imagining lands beyond ordinary reach. Sea travel could make a destination feel both real and remote at the same time. It is not hard to see how travelers, sailors, and coastal communities might have contributed to the imagination of a peaceful western or faraway realm. In a world shaped by the sea, the edges of the map naturally became places where the mind could place wonder. A remote island suggests separation, shelter, and stillness. It is cut off from the violence of the mainland, from the noise of politics, and from the pressures of daily labor. Water surrounds it, and water in ancient thought often served as a boundary between familiar life and whatever lies beyond. That makes Island Elysium especially fitting as an image of rest. It feels protected without becoming harshly enclosed. It is distant but not cold. The geography itself quietly supports the emotional meaning. Later poets would use the phrase Elysian fields to describe landscapes of extraordinary beauty, often without any direct religious context at all. By that point, Elysium had already begun to move beyond a strictly mythic afterlife location. It had become a cultural image of ideal nature, a place where the air is gentle, the light is soft, and the land seems untouched by strain. This kind of poetic expansion is common in the history of myth. A sacred place begins as a specific belief, then gradually becomes a language for describing experience more broadly. A name once tied to the dead can end up evoking a meadow, a garden, or a peaceful afternoon. This transformation shows how mythic geography can become aesthetic language. What was once imagined as a supernatural destination can be used to describe any scene marked by calm and beauty. A field of perfect rest becomes a shorthand for quiet pleasure. In that sense, Elysium survives not only in old beliefs about death, but also in the way people speak about landscape, repose, and beauty itself. The word preserves the feel of something carefully chosen and gently held in memory. There is also a striking emotional modesty in the concept. Elysium does not promise thunder, spectacle, or dramatic revelation. It offers rest, memory, and a harmony of place. The reward is not necessarily overwhelming, it is graceful. That restraint may be one reason the idea has endured so well. Some visions of the afterlife are powerful because they are grand, but Elysium feels enduring because it is calm. It imagines peace not as a triumphal performance, but as a well-earned quiet. Even when later religious systems proposed more detailed heavens, paradises, and celestial orders, Elysium remained valuable because it was quieter and more flexible. It did not need to compete by volume or grandeur. It could speak through atmosphere. A soft inheritance of light can be more lasting than an elaborate architecture of reward. For readers and listeners across many periods, that subdued promise may have felt more human and more restful. As a result, Elysium entered literature with unusual grace. Poets, painters, and philosophers could all borrow it without exhausting its meaning. A painter might use it to suggest a luminous meadow. A poet might use it to soften the image of death. A philosopher might use it to think about reward, virtue, or the fate of the soul. Because the word carries both mythic depth and visual softness, it remains adaptable. It can appear in serious theology, affectionate metaphor, or simply as a beautiful name for peace. In every use, some trace of the original field remains: soft wind, distant light, and the reassuring idea that not all endings are harsh. That is perhaps the deepest reason Elysium has lasted. It offers an image of continuation without fear, a place where what was worthy is not forgotten. Across long stretches of time, that quiet thought has continued to resonate. Another reason Elysium remained compelling is that it was never fully pinned down. Different ancient authors described it differently, and the variations mattered. Sometimes it was a meadow, sometimes an island, sometimes a region at the edge of the world. The lack of absolute consistency did not weaken the idea. Instead, it allowed the place to breathe. It could remain slightly out of focus, which is often how the most durable mythical places survive. When a tradition leaves room for the imagination, it can adapt across generations without losing its charm. That uncertainty also gives Elysium a kind of dream logic. It is not a place mapped by coordinates but by feeling. One tradition may emphasize sunshine, another may emphasize eternal spring, and another may speak more vaguely of ease and blessing. These variations do not cancel each other, they layer together. The result is a destination that feels less like a fixed location and more like an atmosphere of perfected peace. That may be why it has always been so easy for later writers to revisit. The ancient Greek imagination also often placed great importance on the western horizon, where the sun sets. The west could suggest endings, distance, or passage into another mode of being. Elysium's connection with far-off isles or remote regions fits this broader symbolic pattern. The journey westward was not merely a direction on a map, it could feel like a movement toward mystery. As the light changes at sunset, land and sea appear softened, and that visual transition may have helped shape old ideas of a blessed beyond. It is worth remembering, too, that the Greek world was deeply attentive to seasonal change. Fields bloom, wither, and bloom again. A place of eternal flowering would therefore feel deeply appealing. Elysium often evokes exactly that kind of permanence without harshness. It is like spring that never strains or summer without heat. The natural world already offered glimpses of renewal, and mythology could extend those glimpses into imagined eternity. The result was not necessarily an escape from nature, but a perfecting of it. This is one reason the Elysian imagination feels so calm to modern readers. It does not ask us to leave the world behind in a terrifying way. It asks us to imagine the world relieved of pain, loss, and pressure. In that sense, Elysium is not anti-earthly. It is earth made gentle. A softened field, a cleared path, a place where the breeze moves without urgency. Such imagery can be surprisingly restful, especially when held in contrast to the harsher underworld traditions of shadow and division. Scholars sometimes note that Elysium sits at an interesting intersection between religion, poetry, and social memory. It is not only a theological idea, and not only a literary flourish, it is also a way communities preserved their ideals. Who deserves remembrance? What kind of life should be honored? How should excellence be imagined after death? These are social questions as much as religious ones. Elysium answers them with beauty rather than argument, which may explain part of its longevity. The place also reveals something about how the ancient world balanced hope and restraint. Greek myth does not always offer universal consolation. It often recognizes limits, hierarchy, and separation. Elysium belongs to that world of distinctions. Yet within those limits, it still creates a space of genuine tenderness. That balance between selectiveness and mercy helps it feel believable. It is not a fantasy of perfect equality. It is a dream of fitting rest. There is a gentle irony in the fact that a place so strongly associated with the dead has become one of the most serene words in the language of beauty. That transformation shows how memory can change the emotional life of a name. What began as a religiously charged afterlife becomes, over time, a way to describe comfort, elegance, and peace. The old sacredness does not disappear, it simply becomes more diffuse. Even now, when the term is used casually, it still carries a faint echo of reverence. Elysium's endurance may also have to do with its openness to silence. Many myths explain, instruct, or warn. Elysium simply suggests. It does not need to overstate itself. The image of a quiet meadow is enough. For a sleep-friendly narrative, that quality is especially powerful. The mind can rest inside an idea that does not demand urgency. It can imagine light over grass or a shore beyond the waves without needing to solve anything. The image becomes a place to settle. And so, through hero cult, island geography, poetic transformation, and the simple human wish for peaceful continuation, Elysium remained alive in the cultural memory of the West. Its forms changed, but its emotional center stayed steady. It continued to stand for a destination where distinction is honored and rest is possible. Not a loud paradise, not a doctrinal system, but a quiet field of lasting light. By the time writers in the ancient Greek world used the word Elysium, they were not always describing one fixed place so much as a feeling of perfected rest. In the oldest poetic imagination, it appears almost like a far shore of the world, a place set apart from the hard, turning center of ordinary life. Some accounts place it near the edges of the earth, where the air was gentler and the weather seemed to belong to a quieter order. Later, it becomes more clearly a destination for the blessed dead, but even then it keeps that distant shimmer, as if it were less a kingdom on a map than a promise folded into a story. What makes Elysium so enduring is that it never entirely loses its softness. It is always imagined as a place where strain gives way to ease, where the soul is no longer hurried, and where time, if it exists at all, seems to slow into something peaceful and wide. That softness is especially striking when Elysium is compared with the darker regions of the Greek afterlife. In many traditions, the dead do not all go to one destination, and the contrast helps define the calm reputation of Elysium. There is the shadowy collective realm of Hades, where the departed may exist in dim continuation, and there are the harsher punishments reserved for notorious wrongdoers in certain later stories. Against these settings, Elysium stands out like a room filled with late light. Ancient descriptions do not always agree on the details, but they repeatedly emphasize absence of suffering, the regularity of pleasant landscapes, and a life after life marked by harmony rather than struggle. This contrast likely contributed to its appeal. People have always needed places in the imagination where effort can finally stop, and the myth of Elysium offers exactly that kind of relief, not as a loud triumph, but as an untroubled exhale. The geography of Elysium changes across centuries, and that shifting location tells us something gentle about how myths evolve. Early Greek references sometimes imagine it at the edges of the world, beyond the known seas, where the sun could be said to linger differently, and the winds were less severe. Later Roman authors often relocate it into the underworld itself, making it a blessed district within a larger realm of the dead. Still later, especially in literary and philosophical treatments, it becomes less a physical place than a moral reward or a spiritual condition. This migration from distant landscape to interior paradise is revealing. It shows how a myth can travel from the horizon into the human heart. The more people reflected on the meaning of virtue, memory, and death, the more Elysium came to resemble not a remote island, but an inner peace earned through a life lived well, or simply granted by mercy beyond understanding. Another enduring detail is the sensory generosity of Elysium. Ancient writers often filled it with features that feel restful even now: meadows, blooming trees, still waters, and air that never seems to turn heavy or cold. In some accounts, souls spend their time in music, conversation, feasting, or light athletic games, all without strain. The imagery is not dramatic in the usual heroic sense. It is deliberate, open, and restorative. One can almost feel the absence of dust, worry, and hard labor. Such descriptions suggest that paradise in the classical imagination was not defined by ecstasy alone, but by the removal of fatigue. The pleasures of Elysium are often simple pleasures made perfect by their freedom from loss. A shaded grove becomes enough. A breeze over a field becomes enough. A cup, a song, a familiar voice in the distance, all become luminous because nothing is urgent there anymore. It is also worth remembering that Elysium was not always imagined as open to everyone. In many early formulations, the blessedness of the place is reserved for heroes, demi-divine figures, or those favored by the gods. Men like Achilles or Menelaus appear in some traditions as candidates for this extraordinary afterlife, which gives Elysium a noble and somewhat selective character. But this selectivity is not entirely stable. Over time, especially under philosophical and religious influences, the idea can expand or soften. Some later writers and thinkers suggest that moral purity, initiation, or divine favor may grant access beyond mere heroic fame. That change matters because it reveals a quiet broadening of hope. Elysium begins as a reward for exceptional lives and gradually becomes a more universal symbol of peaceful continuation. In that transition, the myth grows more intimate, less about glory and more about deserving rest. The Roman world inherited Elysium and gave it its own layered atmosphere. In Latin literature, especially in poets like Virgil, Elysium becomes a richly imagined region within the underworld, a place of meadows and song where the blessed dead dwell in calm happiness. Virgil's treatment is especially influential because it combines tenderness with grandeur, placing Elysium inside a larger cosmic system of judgment and renewal. Souls in this vision are not simply idle. They may engage in speech, music, and a kind of purified remembrance. Roman Elysium is orderly, almost civic in its serenity, which fits the Roman taste for structured harmony, yet it remains deeply tranquil. There is no frantic reward, no triumphant noise. The scene feels measured, like dusk settling gently over a long valley. In that mood, Elysium becomes one of literature's quietest masterpieces, not because it says little, but because it says peace so clearly. Philosophical interpretations added another dimension to the myth by asking what kind of soul could rightly dwell there. Some ancient thinkers, especially those interested in the soul's purification, treated Elysium as a destination for lives refined by virtue, wisdom, or sacred discipline. In those readings, the place begins to resemble an ethical conclusion rather than a merely inherited paradise. A soul might arrive there not because of earthly power, but because it had become light enough, steady enough, or clean enough in relation to truth. Even where doctrines differ, the underlying intuition remains soothing. A good life is not lost into nothingness, it settles somewhere beautiful. And if later ages disagreed about the exact mechanics of this settlement, they often still preserved the image of repose as a moral fulfillment. The result is a myth that invites contemplation without pressure, suggesting that character itself may have a geography, and that goodness may open into spaciousness. The literature surrounding Elysium also reveals how often paradise is described through agricultural abundance. Fields of flowers, fruit, grain, and perpetual spring appear again and again, not because writers lacked imagination, but because cultivated land was among the most stable and comforting images available to them. In a world where ordinary labor was hard, seasonal, and uncertain, the idea of an eternally fruitful landscape carried deep emotional weight. Elysium promises harvest without exhaustion, growth without threat, and plenty without anxiety. It is not wild wilderness, though it may include groves and streams. It is ordered fertility, the kind that would allow a person to walk slowly and feel nourished just by being there. This makes Elysium quietly domestic in a broad sense. It is the dream of a world that continues to provide, but no longer demands. The earth itself in such a place becomes tender. Some versions of the myth further enrich Elysium by linking it with the Isles of the Blessed, a related but not identical idea. The relationship between these concepts is not always consistent, and scholars continue to discuss how and when they merged or separated in the ancient imagination. Sometimes the Isles of the Blessed are treated as a remote, idyllic destination at the western edge of the world, a kind of maritime paradise. Sometimes Elysium and the Isles are nearly synonymous, and sometimes Elysium becomes the internal or underworld equivalent of an island paradise. This uncertainty is part of the charm. Myths do not always keep clean borders, instead they drift like tides. What matters is the shared emotional field, the same gentle weather, the same freedom from pain, the same sense of arrival after a long journey. Whether one stands in a meadow or on an island shore, the feeling is similar. The world has become kind. In artistic tradition, Elysium has often been drawn as a place of luminous balance, neither intensely ecstatic nor solemnly austere. Painters, poets, and composers have been drawn to its threshold quality because it lets them explore beauty without violence. The scene is often full of long lines, softened horizons, and quiet bodies at rest. In visual terms, Elysium invites pale golds, green distances, and the reflective calm of water under evening light. In music, it has inspired passages that seem to breathe more slowly than the surrounding work. This aesthetic afterlife is important because it shows how the myth continues to function as a creative atmosphere. Even when the details vary, Elysium remains associated with composition, repose, and an almost weightless dignity. It is a place where art does not have to shout to be heard. A single note, a simple gesture, may be enough to suggest that the soul has found its measure. The final thing to notice in this stretch of the tradition is how Elysium has survived because it remains emotionally adaptable. It can be heroic or humble, pagan or philosophical, literary or devotional in spirit. It can stand for reward, purification, memory, or the hope that the dead are not lost to darkness. Different cultures and later writers have kept returning to it because it offers a language for one of humanity's most persistent wishes, that beyond toil, beyond grief, there may be a place of balanced calm. Elysium does not insist on grandeur to be moving. It simply asks us to imagine rest as something beautiful, dignified, and shared. That may be why the name itself still feels soft on the mind. It carries the hush of open fields, the patience of distant light, and the old, steady reassurance that peace can be pictured, even if only for a moment, as a place. By the time later writers tried to describe Elysium, they often reached for the language of distance rather than certainty, as if the place could only be understood from far away, through layers of story and longing. In the older imagination, it was not simply a paradise in the modern sense, but a separate mode of existence, set apart from the ordinary cycle of struggle, labor, and decay. Some accounts place it at the edge of the world, where the sun lingered with a softer quality and where breezes were said to carry no bitterness. Others describe it less like a location and more like a condition, a realm of ease reserved for the specially favored dead. This uncertainty is part of what gives Elysium its quiet power. It could be near the ends of the earth, or beneath the earth, or beyond the reach of geography altogether. Ancient poets did not always agree, and perhaps they did not need to. What mattered was the feeling of removal, the sense that somewhere beyond the visible world there was a place where fatigue dissolved and life became gentle again. Even the name seems to invite a slow exhale, as though the syllables themselves were a small passage into stillness. The earliest Greek references to Elysium are especially interesting because they do not yet present it as the universal reward it would later become. In Homer, the idea appears in a rather restrained and elegant form, a privileged destination where a few chosen heroes might go instead of the common shadow life of Hades. It is not crowded with marble palaces or dramatic trials. Instead, it is described with relative simplicity, almost like a softly blessed outpost at the world's edge. Menelaus, for example, is told he will not die in the usual way, but will be carried to the Elysian plain, where life is easy because the gods have made it so. The detail feels understated, but that restraint is revealing. Early Elysium was not yet the elaborate afterlife of later philosophical or religious systems. It was more like a rare opening in the order of things, a place where exceptional lives might continue in a calmer atmosphere. That early form of the myth suggests a culture already imagining that death did not have to be identical for everyone, that divine favor might alter even the final destination. As the centuries passed, Elysium became more and more layered with imagery. Poets and mythographers began to fill it with meadows, flowering fields, and light that seemed neither harsh nor dim. Sometimes there are trees that remain in bloom, streams that move quietly through the land, and air that never turns oppressive. In some Roman retellings, the landscape grows almost pastoral, as if the most peaceful parts of the countryside had been purified and extended indefinitely. It is worth noticing how often these descriptions depend on ordinary natural comforts rather than exotic splendor. Elysium is not usually imagined as overwhelming or dazzling. It is tranquil. The grass is green, the weather is mild, the earth is fertile without strain. This kind of imagery suggests that paradise was understood not as excess, but as the removal of the things that make existence difficult. No drought, no frost, no sickness, no fatigue. Just a carefully balanced world in which the senses can rest. In that way, Elysium is less about excitement than about relief, and perhaps that is why it has remained so enduring. There is also an important connection between Elysium and moral distinction, though the relationship changes over time. In some of the oldest stories, entrance depends on divine favor, heroic status, or a special relation to the gods. Later traditions, especially in philosophical and religious contexts, begin to imagine a more ethical version of the afterlife, one in which virtue, discipline, and purification play a stronger role. By the time Roman writers were adapting the Greek material, Elysium could be described as the final home of the righteous, the noble, or the spiritually prepared. Yet even then, there is no single rulebook that governs the realm. The boundaries remain fluid. Sometimes it is a reward for soldiers, sometimes for poets, sometimes for initiates, and sometimes for souls who have completed cycles of cleansing. This flexibility allowed Elysium to absorb different cultural hopes without becoming fixed too rigidly. It could be aristocratic or moral, mythic or philosophical. It could belong to the heroic age or to a more introspective world in which the soul's condition mattered more than its birth. One of the most fascinating later developments is the association of Elysium with mystery cults and initiatory beliefs, especially in traditions influenced by Orphic and Dionysian ideas. In those settings, the afterlife was no longer simply a matter of heroic privilege. It became part of a wider spiritual journey, one shaped by purification, ritual knowledge, and the promise that the soul might escape a cycle of wandering. Elysium in this context could stand not just for rest, but for fulfillment after long effort. The soul had endured, learned, and been refined. Some texts hint that those who had been properly initiated would dwell in blessed regions after death, while the uninitiated faced a more uncertain fate. The exact details are often elusive, partly because these traditions were secretive and partly because later authors reconstructed them with their own assumptions. Still, the basic atmosphere is clear enough. Elysium became a place where the hidden work of spiritual life finally unfolded into serenity. What had been tested in darkness could emerge into light, not violently, but gradually, like dawn spreading across a quiet plain. When Roman poets took up the idea, they gave Elysium some of its most enduring literary form. Virgil's Aeneid, especially, presents the place with remarkable tenderness. Aeneas enters the underworld and eventually reaches the Elysian fields, where the blessed live in a luminous calm, engaged in pursuits that suit their deepest natures. Some are training, some are singing, some are remembering. There is an eerie softness in the scene, because even in death, identity remains. The souls there are not erased, they are gently continued. Virgil's Elysium is neither a loud triumph nor a merely static rest. It is alive with softened activity, as if eternal peace still contains the rhythm of meaningful existence. This balance between movement and stillness helped shape later Western notions of paradise. The soul does not simply vanish into emptiness, nor does it remain trapped in the distress of mortal life. It enters a landscape where purpose has been purified of struggle. The poem lingers there with a kind of reverence, and readers have often responded to that mood, sensing that the blessed dead are not so much absent as quietly restored. It is also striking how often Elysium exists alongside darker models of the afterlife, rather than replacing them. In many ancient systems, the underworld was divided into regions of punishment, neutrality, and reward. Elysium occupied one part of that larger geography, set in contrast with places of gloom or torment. This arrangement reveals a sophisticated moral imagination. The afterlife was not simply one thing, it was a landscape of consequence with different spaces for different souls. Yet Elysium often remained the most atmospheric of these regions, because its descriptions invited the reader not to fear but to rest. Even when placed in a mapped underworld, it felt open and airy. The fields were broad, the sunlight gentle, the mood almost suspended. It is interesting that a place of the dead could be described with such lifelike calm. The ancient imagination seems to have needed both separation and continuity. Separation from suffering, continuity of memory, rhythm, identity, and reverent company. Elysium delivered all of that in a single image, which may be why it continued to echo through later centuries. By the classical and Hellenistic periods, Elysium could also be linked to islands, especially the idea of the Isles of the Blessed. This shift is important because islands carry their own symbolic logic. They are enclosed, protected by water, slightly removed from the ordinary world, yet still tangible. A paradise as an island feels both reachable in imagination and impossible in ordinary travel. Ancient geographers sometimes speculated about far western lands, remote archipelagos or sunlit shores beyond known seas, and myth naturally flowed into those half-mapped spaces. The island version of Elysium is especially restful because it suggests a gentle boundary. Water surrounds it like a quiet veil. There are no roads leading in and out, no bustle of commerce, only the soft enclosure of a place apart. Some later traditions blurred Elysium with these blessed islands almost completely, and the distinction became less important than the overall feeling. A remote, pure, protected world where the dead who had earned peace could dwell in lasting calm. The sensory language associated with Elysium deserves attention too, because it is usually light, fragrant, and unhurried. Ancient descriptions often mention breezes, flowers, music, and clear weather. Sometimes there are meadows where the ground remains spring-like, or groves where leaves never wither. The soundscape is equally gentle. Birds may sing, streams may murmur, and heroes may speak without the noise of conflict. Even when the place includes athletic or musical activity, it is never frantic. The sensory world of Elysium is designed to soothe. It offers the idealized opposite of war, labor, fever, and loss. That is likely why the imagery proved so adaptable across literature. Readers in different ages could insert their own longing into it. For some, Elysium meant reunion. For others, it meant rest. For others still, it meant vindication, beauty, or the end of uncertainty. Because the place is painted in broad, soft strokes, it can receive many emotional meanings without losing its character. It remains a realm of quiet brightness, a destination imagined not through pressure but through relief. At the same time, scholars have long noted that Elysium was never entirely separate from religious and political ideology. In many cultures, the promise of a peaceful afterlife can reflect values cherished by the living. Heroes are rewarded because heroism matters. Initiates are welcomed because sacred knowledge matters. The virtuous find rest because virtue is praised. In that sense, Elysium is not only about the dead, it is also about the society that dreams it up. Yet the myth has enough openness to transcend the systems that shaped it. A farmer listening to a recitation of the tale might imagine fields without hardship. A soldier might imagine release from battle. A philosopher might imagine the soul purified by truth. A poet might imagine a place where memory itself becomes music. This versatility helped Elysium survive changing eras, even as specific doctrinal beliefs shifted around it. It was never a rigid doctrine in the first place. It was a luminous possibility, and possibilities tend to endure because they can be reimagined. There is a final subtlety worth noticing. Elysium is often described as a place for the blessed dead, yet it never feels entirely static. The blessed are not always passive recipients of reward. They may converse, remember, sing, train, reflect, or dwell in communities shaped by their former lives. This matters because it preserves personhood. The afterlife is not a blankness but a continuation in gentler form. In that sense, Elysium answers a very deep human wish, that the essence of a life once purified of pain might still remain itself. Ancient writers did not always agree on the mechanics, and modern readers may never be able to pin the myth to a single doctrinal meaning. But perhaps that is fitting. Elysium was never meant to be reduced too neatly. It belongs to the realm of dimly remembered comfort, of belief softened by poetry, of certainty made unnecessary by peace. And so the image persists, tranquil and remote, like a far meadow scene in late light, where everything difficult has already passed and only calm remains. In the later imagination of Elysium, one of the quietest details is how often it was not pictured as a single place, but as a layered distance, a realm approached in stages rather than entered all at once. Ancient writers sometimes seem less interested in a precise map than in the feeling of arrival, as if Elysium were defined by the slowing of the soul more than by geography. The old descriptions drift between meadow, shore, island, orchard, and bright open field, and that variety matters. It suggests that Elysium was never only a location in the narrow sense. It was also a way of imagining perfect rest, a place where the ordinary pressures of life no longer held. In some accounts, the dead who reach it are carried there by special winds, or borne across water, or guided by divine favor through a boundary that cannot be seen by the living. Scholars still debate how much of this language comes from very early Greek poetry and how much was gradually gathered later, as myth absorbed local hopes from different regions of the Mediterranean. Yet the emotional pattern remains remarkably steady. Elysium is always somewhere just beyond labor, just beyond the final horizon, where the world becomes spacious and gentle enough to breathe in full. That sense of spaciousness is one reason Elysium often appears in ancient texts as a climate rather than a kingdom. The air there is famously mild, never harsh, and the weather seems to obey a softer law than the one governing the mortal world. In some traditions, the land knows neither winter frost nor burning summer, and the fields remain fertile without struggle. This is not only a poetic convenience, it reflects a deep cultural longing for continuity, for fruit that does not fail, for seasons that do not wound the body. The Greeks lived with sharp contrasts in climate and landscape, and so a place beyond death that removed extremes would have felt both miraculous and deeply comforting. Even the breezes in Elysium are often described as gentle, as though the very atmosphere had been taught to move carefully. One can imagine the effect of such an image on listeners hearing the poem at night, the mind softening at the idea of endless temperance, of a place where heat never overwhelms and cold never bites, where everything remains balanced and almost softly luminous. The ancients had no need to describe every blade of grass in that world. The relief itself was enough. And yet Elysium was not always imagined as static stillness. A curious part of its appeal is that it preserved activity without strain. Many versions of the myth allow the blessed dead to converse, walk, sing, or enjoy the company of loved ones, while the pressure and urgency that make work painful have quietly fallen away. This is an important distinction. Elysium is not sleep in the sense of blankness. It is more like a transformed waking, where effort is no longer taxed by anxiety. The heroes of myth do not lie down in silence forever unless the story asks them to. They continue in a state of gracious being. In some texts, there are banquets, music, and even athletic contests, though all seem stripped of rivalry's sharp edges. The golden age quality of Elysium may be connected to older Mediterranean ideas about blessed existence after death, perhaps also to royal or heroic burial traditions in which the honored dead were thought to retain a noble kind of life. What remains striking is that the realm is active but never rushed. Time itself in those descriptions feels open and untroubled, as if it had been unknotted. The inhabitants of Elysium are likewise a matter of changing tradition. At times the realm is reserved for heroes, demigods, and specially favored mortals, while at other moments it becomes more broadly available to righteous souls or to those chosen by divine judgment. This shift tells a lot about the growth of Greek religious imagination. Early heroic culture tended to emphasize distinction, honoring exceptional deeds and extraordinary ancestry. Later philosophical and religious currents, however, began to widen the doorway. As beliefs about the soul became more elaborate, the afterlife itself could be moralized, softened, or made more just. Elysium then functions not merely as a reward for battlefield fame, but as the destination of lives considered excellent in some deeper sense. Even so, the old heroic flavor never disappears entirely. The blessed in Elysium still often seem nobly singular, carrying an afterglow of renown with them. There is no sense that the place is crowded by ordinary noise. Instead, it remains selective, calm, and dignified, a landscape suited to memory's finest voices. The uncertainty over who exactly belongs there is part of its long history, and perhaps part of its haunting beauty as well. The question of location is equally fluid, and that fluidity has helped Elysium survive so long in the imagination. Homer placed the blissful fields at the edge of the world, near the setting of the sun, where winds from Oceanus may have touched the land. Later traditions moved the blessed realm to the western islands, sometimes called the Isles of the Blessed, and in some cases identified them with a fortunate island chain at the end of the sea. The west mattered because it was the direction of sunset, of departure, of the day's quiet closing. It also fit the ancient habit of situating wonder beyond familiar travel routes. For some Greek audiences, the idea that Elysium might exist somewhere in the Mediterranean fringe made the myth feel almost geographical, as if a fortunate sailor might one day glimpse its luminous coast. For others, the exact location was less important than the symbolic movement toward remoteness. The farther one traveled from the crowded center of mortal life, the more appropriate the setting became for peace. Over time, Elysium became both destination and direction, a westward drift of thought itself, carrying the mind away from burden. In Roman literature, especially, Elysium acquired a highly polished literary life. Writers such as Virgil brought the realm into the architecture of epic, placing it within a larger underworld of judgment and destiny. In the Aeneid, the Elysian fields are not just a vague paradise, but a structured part of the afterlife where worthy souls continue in beauty and rest. This Roman shaping gave Elysium a more formal and moral outline, though it never lost its lyrical softness. The Romans were often fascinated by order, and in their hands the afterlife could resemble an empire of the dead, with distinct regions for different fates. Elysium then became the bright and honourable province of that invisible realm. Virgil's influence was enormous, and later readers came to think of Elysium through his lines, with their measured grandeur and stately calm. Yet even when made more official, the place retains its dreamlike openness. The dead there still hear music, the meadows still gleam. The whole scene has the filtered light of a memory recited by firelight, one of those descriptions that seems to lower the room's temperature just by being spoken. There is also a fascinating ambiguity in how Elysium relates to justice. Unlike some later afterlife systems that divide the dead in strict moral terms, Elysium can feel less like a courtroom verdict and more like a gesture of favor. In some mythic strands, the blessed arrive because of lineage, divine sympathy, or heroic achievement rather than explicit ethical perfection. This does not make the place less meaningful. If anything, it reveals an older, more personal mode of sacred reward. The gods in Greek myth are not always moral in the modern sense, and Elysium reflects that complexity. It is a realm of grace before it is a realm of justice. Still, later thinkers sometimes try to align it with virtue, imagining that souls of remarkable purity or discipline might enter the fields. Philosophical traditions then layered ethical seriousness onto the old poetic landscape, turning Elysium into an image of the soul's deserved peace. The tension between gift and merit never fully disappears. That is part of what makes the myth feel human. The deepest rest may come not because it can be earned neatly, but because existence is finally met with mercy. And in the ancient mind, mercy and beauty often belong together. The sensory details of Elysium are unusually tender, and they have helped the place endure in art and literature. It is often associated with flowers that do not wither, with meadows that remain green, with trees whose branches are always heavy with fruit or blossom. Music is another recurring feature, but it is rarely loud. More often it seems to drift through the air like a thread of polished silk, perhaps from lyres, pipes, or choral voices. The ground itself is sometimes said to be soft and forgiving beneath the feet of the blessed. These images create a world with almost no resistance. Even light behaves gently there, spreading without glare. Scholars sometimes point out that such details connect Elysium to agricultural abundance, because harvest and repose were inseparable in ancient imagination. To live well meant to live where the earth cooperated, so it is fitting that the afterlife of comfort should resemble an ideal countryside made permanent. The flowers, the shade, the fresh water, the cool wind, all of it contributes to a sensory grammar of peace. One does not need to imagine dramatic splendor. The power of Elysium lies in small, sustained kindnesses, in a landscape that seems to take care of itself, and by extension of those who dwell within it. That gentleness also shaped how later poets and artists reused the name Elysium. Even when the specific mythological setting changed, the word itself remained a shorthand for tranquility beyond ordinary reach. In English and other European languages, Elysian came to mean more than merely classical. It suggested beauty so soft it almost seemed unrecoverable, a sweetness that belongs to memory, dream, or idealized nature. Painters drew on the idea to create pastoral scenes that felt suspended outside time. Poets used it to evoke not only heaven, but the emotional atmosphere of heaven, ease, clarity, and the relief of no longer needing to hurry. This literary afterlife is itself a kind of Elysium of the word. It survives by becoming portable, carried from myth into metaphor. The astonishing thing is how little the meaning has needed to change. Even now, when people speak of Elysian calm, they are usually reaching for exactly the same emotional horizon the ancients sought. A place where the spirit can settle, a place where beauty does not demand effort, a place where the mind at last can rest its weight. One of the most interesting scholarly questions about Elysium concerns whether it should be read as a purely Greek invention or as part of a wider ancient pattern of blessed afterworlds. Comparisons have often been made to the Egyptian field of reeds, to Near Eastern paradises, and to later notions of heaven. These comparisons do not mean the myths are identical, but they do suggest that human beings across different cultures repeatedly imagined an ideal beyond death as an improved version of life's most peaceful conditions. That convergence is revealing. It hints that paradise is often built from the memory of ordinary comfort: good weather, companionship, fruitfulness, music, safety, and time without fear. Elysium may be Greek in name and in literary shaping, yet it belongs to a much larger human tendency. The ancient Mediterranean was a world of exchange, and ideas about the dead traveled as easily as trade goods and stories. So while scholars can trace particular lines of development, they still have to admit a broader mystery. Why do so many civilizations dream of a garden, a meadow, or an island of rest? Perhaps because such images are among the most natural the human mind can make when it tries to imagine relief. Elysium is one answer among many, but it remains one of the most graceful. And finally, what may be most enduring about Elysium is that it never entirely closes the distance between myth and feeling. Even when modern readers do not believe in the ancient cosmology, they often recognize the emotional truth inside it. The wish to imagine a place where suffering has thinned, where loved ones might meet again, where the soul is no longer pressed by time, is not a small wish. It is one of the oldest and softest hopes people have ever held. Elysium gives that hope form without harsh edges. It does not insist on doctrine. It lingers. It lets the mind walk slowly through a bright field and look toward a horizon that does not threaten. In that sense, the myth is less about death than about consolation. It teaches the imagination how to picture rest. And as the story passes from ancient song to later poetry, from philosophy to art, from translation to memory, it keeps the same quiet promise that beyond the long work of living, there may be a place where the air is mild, the light is kind, and nothing asks to be hurried. And now, as the night grows quieter, we can let Elysium drift away like a fading horizon. If you are falling asleep, you do not need to hold on to any of it. The calm is enough. The old stories can rest, and you can rest with them. Good night, and may your thoughts be gentle.